We have a moral rule against unfairness, unfair distributions, unfair and that sort of thing. And the emotional response here, there are a number of emotional responses, but in particular there are some very nice recent experiments that have something to do with what I'm sure you've by now heard about, because it's become, it's become the topic of newspaper and magazine articles all over the place, the ultimatum game. In the ultimatum game, which I'll describe in a second, emotions are aroused which apparently are specific emotions about fairness and unfairness. And it could be, actually, that this is one of the few things in this whole, in all these 5 domains, that has only partial antecedents in other animals, because other primates don't seem to feel as much as bad about unfairness as we do. Okay, here's how the ultimatum game works. I've got 2 subjects, and I give one of them $100 or $10, or it doesn't matter what, and I say, okay, you can now offer any amount from that $100, which I haven't given you, but I will give you. If that person accepts your offer, then you will get the respective sums of money. But if the person rejects it, you will get nothing. Now, from the strictly self-interested economic point of view, suppose that you have $100 and you offer me $1. I have nothing to lose by accepting the dollar. I should accept it, even though I may think you're a shit. What happens is that my thinking you're a shit, or some equivalent of that emotion, actually causes people to reject offers that are lower than about 30%. Even more interesting, the idea of the non-equivalence of those shares, when it is extreme even in my favor, is rejected at least by some people in some cultures. Not Americans. Koreans. So, it turns out then that people do not behave as economists think that people ought to be behaving, if they are indeed economic agents. And the reason for this is apparently that they're willing to take a loss just for the pleasure of punishing someone else. Now, since this can't be an economic, in the simple sense, fact, there's got to be the intervention of some emotional factor here that motivates you. Now, one researcher whom I heard talk about this a couple of years ago made the very interesting discovery that if you just tell the recipient that they can write a note to the offerer, whatever the content is, it doesn't matter what the content is, just writing a note to the offerer lowers the incidence of rejection to practically 0. And that suggests that by writing a note, you've done something which has some sort of emotional effect on you, and that having done that, you might as well take the dollar. Right? Because you've, as it were, diffused the impulse of spite. Spite is defined technically as doing something that harms you, yourself, for the sake of harming the other person. Now, I said that the case of other primates is moot because it turns out that chimps apparently, insofar as we've been able to devise experiments about this, some people say that they do care about fairness and some say that they don't. But what is apparently clear is, on the one hand, chimps do sometimes sort of fly into a rage when they're offered what appears to be, not enough of a reward compared to someone else. But on the other hand, if they're offered by the other a share in a rather mechanical way, which involves their having to sort of pull a tray in which there are either an unequal number of raisins on 2 things, one of which I can attain and the other one of which the other can't attain, the chimp will just pull the tray to get whatever they can get most of the time and won't, by and large, reject unfair offers. So this question of whether there is a non-human version of the fairness thing is unclear. But it's the only thing that is, to that extent, unclear. Let's now get to the three domains that are not part of the, as it were, liberal package. Loyalty, moral rule, is to prefer family and tribe. Somebody who lives in a tribal society, and I think one can very much see this kind of thing happening in some immigrant populations in Toronto, where there are these incredibly conflicting things going on in people's minds, saying, how could you possibly give the job to this person who is a total stranger when your cousin needs a job, right? And on the other hand, people say, well, you know, giving it to the cousin, that's what we call nepotism, and that's not acceptable because you should give the job to the person who's most qualified. An argument which holds absolutely no force whatsoever for someone who is inside this sort of tribal perspective in which loyalty is a crucial moral value. It's obvious what the emotions are here, and it's pretty obvious also what their antecedents are in terms of natural selection, because kin selection, which plays an important role in the explanation of altruism, that is to say people's disposition to do things for the other people which are not good for themselves, kin selection is simply the mechanism by which those people who share my genes can be benefited, and even if I die, they'll pass on the same genes. And so those genes, if they are indeed the kinds of genes that would lead me to benefit my kin, will continue to exist in the population. Now, authority has to do with the moral rule of submitting to your superiors, and possibly more rules that govern hierarchies in general. The emotional responses have to do with deference, contempt, scorn, the fear of challenging authority, perhaps in some cases the thrill of challenging authority, etc. But all of this can only make sense in terms of the existence of what is clearly observed in other primates and in other social species like wolves, namely the existence of dominance hierarchies, in which you see behaviors that are symbolically expressive of submission or dominance, as in the image of these wolves here. Purity is the last of these domains, and it arises out of the emotion of disgust. And the emotion of disgust, which first exists in